The year is 1395. A winter wind howls over the snow-covered steppe, filling the lands along the Terek River with a dirge for a fallen empire. Mingled in its piercing cry are the screams of the dying, the cawing of crows feasting on the bodies of 100,000 warriors, and the crackle of burning supply wagons. Amidst this apocalypse, upon a lathered, trembling horse, stands a man whose face, weathered and covered in soot, seems carved from gray stone. This is Tokhtamysh, Khan of the Golden Horde, ruler of the world from the Irtysh to the Dnieper, a descendant of Chinggis Khan. Only days ago, he led an unstoppable avalanche into battle, dreaming of crushing his former patron and current enemy, the great Tamerlane. Now, his army is merely a bloody pulp, trampled into the frozen earth by the hooves of the iron cripple's horses. His empire, which he had so painstakingly pieced together from the ashes of civil war, is burning on a funeral pyre. In his eyes is not just the bitterness of defeat, but the bottomless abyss of realization. He, the great unifier, the restorer of the power of the Ulis of Jochi, had become the one who brought the apocalypse to his own land. He looked upon the work of his hands and understood that he had become the executioner of his own dream. This moment is not the end of the story, but its beginning, the starting point of our narrative. It is here, on the ashes of his own greatness, that the main agonizing question is born, a question that will follow us to the very end. How? How did the last great Khan, who revived the Golden Horde from oblivion, turn into its greatest destroyer? What demons drove him? What fatal error in calculation? What measureless pride made him challenge fate itself in the form of Tamerlane, and in doing so, signed the death warrant for his people and his state? To find the answer, we must return to the very beginning, to that roiling cauldron of anarchy and blood from which this man emerged, both great and cursed. To understand the tragedy of Tokhtamysh, one must first grasp the world into which he was born. For the Golden Horde, the second half of the 14th century was a time that Russian chroniclers aptly named the Great Troubles. This was not merely a period of turmoil, but the agony of a gigantic organism devouring itself from within. The empire that once struck terror from the walls of Krakow to the borders of China had become a ghost of its former glory. Imagine a vast chessboard where the pieces have gone mad. The white and black squares have blended, kings died with every move, and pawns declared themselves queens. In the 20 years from 1360 to 1380, more than 25 Khans sat on the throne in the capital city of Sarai Burq. Some ruled for a year, others for a week, and some for only a few hours before being stabbed by the next claimant. The authority of the Khan, a descendant of Chinggis Khan, became nominal, a mere screen behind which the real puppeteers hid. These puppeteers were powerful emirs, commanders, and bailer boys, the most famous of whom was Mamai. Not being a Chingisid, he could not bear the title of Khan, but it was he who, like Cardinal Richelieu, ruled in the name of puppet leaders, enthroning and overthrowing them at his whim. The state had effectively disintegrated into several warring domains, each controlled by its own clan. The White Horde in the east, the Blue Horde in the west, the once unified Ulis of Jochi had become a patchwork quilt stitched with rotten threads. The trade routes, along which gold and silk once flowed, became unsafe. The Russian principalities, sensing their master's weakness, raised their heads and increasingly dared to withhold tribute. The Battle of Kulikovo in 1380, where Dmitry Donskoy defeated Mamai's forces, became a symbol of this decline. It was a world saturated with the smell of betrayal and cheap blood, a world where legitimacy had drowned in intrigue, and the law of the strong had become the only law. And it was in this chaos, in this power vacuum, where everyone was ready to tear at another's throat for a shadow of the throne, that someone had to appear who would either finally destroy this rotten house or rebuild it anew. History awaited its hero or its gravedigger. It got both in one person. In this world, where the blood of Genghis Khan was both the ultimate trump card and a death sentence, Tokhtamysh's origin defined his entire destiny. He was no random adventurer. He was a direct descendant of Yoshi, the eldest and most beloved son of the conqueror of the universe. His lineage traced back to Timur, the 13th son of Yoshi, which made him a prince of the blood, and Ak-Suyek, white bone. In the eyes of the steppe aristocracy, this gave him an indisputable sacred right to the throne of the Golden Horde, a right that the same Mamai, a mere commander from the Kiat tribe, lacked. But this same blood also carried a family curse. From the moment the unified Mongol Empire disintegrated, the House of Jochi was consumed by the flames of fratricidal wars. Cousins slaughtered one another, uncles poisoned nephews, and sons marched against their fathers. Power in the steppe was never transferred peacefully. It was always taken by force, and the price of that power was measured in the blood of the closest relatives. Tokhtamysh's father, Tuikoja, the ruler of Manghishlak, became another victim of this curse. He was executed on the orders of his own cousin, Urus Khan, the powerful sovereign of the White Horde, who saw a mortal threat in any potential rival. Thus, in his youth, Tokhtamysh learned the primary law of steppe politics: kill or be killed. His high birth became his brand. He was the legitimate heir, but without a throne, without an army, and without land. He was a symbol of legitimacy in a world ruled by brute force. This contradiction became the internal fire that burned within him. He was not just an exile. He was a prince whose sacred rights had been violated. And this shadow of his murdered father, the shadow of a betrayed dynasty, would haunt him all his life, turning into an obsession to reclaim what was his by birthright at any cost. It was this legacy, full of greatness and blood, that would become the foundation of his future character. Proud, like a descendant of great Khans, and ruthless, like a hunted wolf cub who survived in a pack of hungry predators. As is common in epic tales, the birth and destiny of the future great Khan were shrouded in the mists of legend and omens, which, as later chronicles attest, were passed by word of mouth around campfires and in the yurts of the steppe aristocracy. One such legend, perhaps born after his tragic fall to make sense of his journey, tells of a meeting between his father, Tuikoja, and a wandering Sufi dervish, revered in the steppe as a holy seer. When Tuikoja, proud of his newborn son, asked the old man to foretell his future, the dervish looked at the infant for a long time and then spoke enigmatic words. "This boy is marked with the seal of fire and iron. He will gather the scattered flames of the steppe campfires into one great blaze that will warm and unite the people of Yoki. He will make those who have forgotten their obedience pay tribute, and his name will thunder like a storm. But beware of the iron, for the very iron he summons to fan his flame will, in the end, turn against him and shatter his throne, and the sparks from that blow will burn the entire horde to the ground." This parable, regardless of its authenticity, reflects the entire arc of Tokhtamysh's life with astonishing accuracy. The flame is his own indomitable energy and will to power, with which he did indeed unite the crumbling horde. The great blaze is his triumph, culminating in the campaign against Moscow, where the flames of the fires announced the restoration of the horde's might. But the iron he summoned was none other than Amir Timur, the iron cripple, by whose iron will and iron tumens Tokhtamysh was raised to the throne. And it was this very iron, this alliance that seemed to him a tool for achieving greatness, that ultimately became the instrument of his own demise and the destruction of his empire. This legend, like an ancient Greek tragedy, speaks of the inevitability of fate, of how the seed of a hero's future downfall is often hidden in the very source of his strength. And the rest of Tokhtamysh's life would be an unconscious fulfillment of this grim prophecy, where every step toward the pinnacle of glory was also a step toward the edge of the abyss. The years of exile became for Tokhtamysh the merciless forge, where the heated metal of his soul was shaped into a deadly blade under the hammer blows of fate. After the murder of his father by the powerful ruler of the White Horde, Urus Khan, the young prince was forced to flee, and his life turned into an endless race for survival. He was prey, hunted by Urus Khan's finest warriors. He hid in the reeds of the Sir Daria, starved in the deserts of the Kizilkum, and found temporary shelter with minor chieftains who would sometimes give him refuge and sometimes betray him, fearing the wrath of the all-powerful Khan. These years of humiliation and fear did not break him. On the contrary, they forged his unique character. He learned to trust no one, to read lies in people's eyes, to distinguish true allies from temporary companions. He understood that mercy was a luxury that someone who wants to survive cannot afford. Every betrayal made him more cynical, every stroke of luck more calculating. He perfected the art of pretense, capable of being courteous and flattering when necessary, and a ruthless predator when he sensed an opponent's weakness. Unlike many steppe aristocrats who grew up in luxury, he knew the price of a piece of bread and a sip of water. He knew what cold and despair felt like. This closeness to the black bone, to the common warriors and shepherds with whom he shared the hardships of his wanderings, gave him an understanding of their psychology, an ability to speak their language, which would later greatly help him in building his army. But the main lesson he learned was about the nature of power. He saw that even the mighty Urus Khan, who had killed his father, was constantly looking over his shoulder, fearing conspiracies. He realized that power was not a right, but a state of perpetual war. A war not only with external enemies, but also with one's own circle. And a chilling conviction took root in his soul. To find security, one must obtain absolute power. Not partial, not shared, but complete, undivided power that would allow him to never be a victim again, to never again have to run and be humiliated. It was in these wanderings that not just a future Khan was born, but a new type of politician, pragmatic, cunning, and utterly ruthless, ready to do anything to achieve his goal. Tokhtamysh's first steps on the path to power were a series of daring but doomed gambles that nevertheless became his baptism by fire and announced him as a new force in the Steppe's Game of Thrones. Gathering a small band of exiles and fortune-seekers like himself, he made his first desperate attempt to challenge Urus Khan. It was less a military campaign and more the raid of a wolf pack, audacious and fierce. He managed to briefly capture a few small towns on the Sir Daria, but as soon as the main forces of the White Horde moved against him, his small detachment was crushed and scattered. In one of the skirmishes, he was wounded by an arrow and nearly captured. The defeat was total, but it had immense psychological significance. First, Tokhtamysh had shed first blood. He had tasted battle not as a common warrior, but as a leader, a contender for the throne. He learned firsthand what it meant to command men, the price of a mistake, and the sweetness of victory, however brief. Second, his name began to be heard across the steppe. People spoke of him not just as the son of the murdered Tuikoja, but as the man who dared to challenge Urus Khan himself. This attracted new followers, those who were dissatisfied with the iron fist of the White Horde's ruler. A second and third attempt followed. Each was more thought out than the last, but the result remained the same: defeat at the hands of a superior force. These failures taught him a crucial lesson that would define his entire future strategy: Chinggis blood and personal bravery. Alone were not enough. In this world, the victor is not the one who is right, but the one who has more swords. He realized that to fight a giant like Urus Khan, he needed more than just a band of warriors. He needed a powerful external patron who could provide him with resources, an army, and political support. These early defeats did not break his will, but only sharpened his mind. He recognized the limits of his own capabilities and understood that to win this war, he needed to find a piece on the world's chessboard even more powerful than Urus Khan. And his gaze, full of cold resolve, turned south toward Samarkand, where a new master of Asia was rising, a man whose name was already spoken with fear and admiration: Emir Timur. Behind all of Tokhtamysh's actions, behind his desperate courage and cold calculation, lay a single, all-consuming secret passion that was both his driving force and his inner demon. It was not simply a thirst for power for its own sake. For him, power was merely a tool. His true goal, his obsession, was what he considered the restoration of historical justice in its highest form. In his mind, shaped by the stories of elders and his own humiliation, there existed an idealized, mythical image of the Golden Horde from the time of its founders, Batu Khan and his brother Berka. This was not the fragmented and humiliated country he saw around him, but a great empire stretching across half the world, unified, mighty, before which all nations trembled. An empire where the Khan's word was law, where Russian princes humbly crawled for the patent to rule, where caravans of silk and spices traveled unhindered from China to Europe, enriching the treasury. This dream of a golden age became a kind of religion for him. He saw himself not as just another Khan, but as a messiah, chosen by heaven to restore lost greatness. The murder of his father and the years of exile only fueled this obsession, giving it a personal, vengeful character. To restore the empire meant not only fulfilling a historic mission, but also avenging all his humiliations, proving to all the Urus Khans and Mamais that he, Tokhtamysh, was the true heir of Genghis Khan. This secret motivation explains many of his later, seemingly irrational actions. It explains his incredible cruelty in the taking of Moscow. He was not just punishing disobedient vassals, he was ritually restoring the old order. It explains his future conflict with Tamerlane. In his worldview, there could not be two suns in the sky. Tamerlane, not being a Chinggis, was in his eyes merely a powerful emir, an upstart who should serve the legitimate descendants of the conqueror of the universe. This inner demon, this obsession with a great past, pushed him forward, giving him inhuman energy to unite the Horde, but it also blinded him, preventing him from soberly assessing the changed reality, and led him to a collision with a force that crushed both him and his dream. The fateful moment that defined Tokhtamysh's rise came when, once again defeated and pursued, he crossed the border of Urus Khan's domains and arrived at the court of Emir Timur in Samarkand. This meeting was a collision of two worlds and two ambitions. On one side, a young, proud, but dispossessed Chinggis, in whose veins flowed the noblest blood of the steppe. On the other, a man no longer young, hardened in dozens of battles, a lame but unyielding Turkic emir who, without the right to the title of Khan, was building his empire with an iron fist and a brilliant mind. Tamerlane, or the Iron Cripple, was a master of the great political game. He immediately saw in Tokhtamysh not just a supplicant, but a perfect tool for realizing his own plans. The Golden Horde, even in its state of decline, remained a serious threat to Timur's northern borders. Maintaining chaos there was advantageous, but it was even more advantageous to place his own, completely dependent and controllable ruler at its head. Tokhtamysh was perfect for this role. He was a legitimate Chinggis, which would ensure him the support of the steppe aristocracy. He was in a desperate situation and completely dependent on Timur's will. And finally, he was a bitter enemy of Urus Khan, who also posed a threat to Timur. The Iron Cripple's calculation was simple and brilliant. He would help Tokhtamysh conquer the throne of his ancestors, and in gratitude, Tokhtamysh would become his loyal vassal, the northern shield of his burgeoning empire. Timur received the fugitive with ostentatious hospitality and paternal care. He showered him with gifts, gave him cities to govern, and most importantly, provided him with troops. Time and again, he supplied Tokhtamysh with fresh tumens for campaigns against Urus Khan and his sons. The first expeditions ended in failure again, but Timur, with inhuman patience, continued to support his protege. It was as if he were investing in a risky but potentially super profitable project. And in the end, this bet paid off. After the death of Urus Khan and his heirs, the White Horde fell into its own strife, and Tokhtamysh, invading with an army provided by Timur, was finally able to defeat his enemies and seize the throne. Thus began his ascent, paid for with the gold of Samarkand and the blood of Timurid soldiers. But Timur, the great strategist, made one mistake. He underestimated the depth of ambition in the man he considered his puppet. He thought he was creating a loyal dog, but in reality, he was feeding a young dragon with his own hands. Having ascended the throne of the White Horde with Tamerlane's help, Tokhtamysh did not rest on his laurels. He acted with a speed and decisiveness that shocked all his contemporaries. His energy, forged by years of wandering, burst forth like a coiled spring. He did not indulge in the power he held in his eastern domain. His gaze was fixed on the west, on Sarai, on the lands of the Blue Horde, where, after the defeat by Dmitry Donskoy at the Battle of Kulikovo, the usurper Mamai's power was hanging by a thread. Tokhtamysh laid claim to the entire Ulus of Yochi, declaring himself the one true Khan. It was a brilliant political move. The entire steppe aristocracy, tired of the rule of the non-Chinggis Mamai and the Great Troubles, saw in Tokhtamysh the hope for restoring order and law. Emirs with their detachments began to flock to him. In the decisive battle on the Kalka River in 1380, the very same river where Subutai and Jebe had once won their first great victory over the Rus Kuman forces, Tokhtamysh faced Mamai. The outcome of the battle was decided before it even began. A large part of Mamai's army, unwilling to fight against a legitimate descendant of Chinggis Khan, defected to Tokhtamysh's side. Mamai fled to Crimea, where he was killed by the Genoese. In just a few years, from 1380 to 1382, the unthinkable happened. The Golden Horde was once again united under the hand of a single ruler. From the Altai in the east to the Dniester in the west, from Siberia in the north to the Caucasus Mountains in the south, everywhere the authority of Khan Tokhtamysh was recognized. The Great Troubles, which had lasted for 2 decades, were over. The world he built was strikingly different from the chaos from which he had emerged. He restored the central administration and began minting coins with his name, the ultimate symbol of sovereign power. He brutally suppressed any attempts at separatism, executing disobedient emirs. Under his rule, all the ancestral lands of the Golden Horde, including Bulgar, Haji Tarkhan, the future Astrakhan, and Crimea, were his once more. the geopolitical landscape had changed dramatically. In place of a dozen warring principalities, a single, monolithic, and aggressive empire had re-emerged. And this new, reborn horde immediately turned its gaze upon its neighbors, primarily the Russian principalities, which, during the years of turmoil, had forgotten what true Khanate power felt like. The pinnacle of Tokhtamysh's ascent, and the most brilliant demonstration of his military and political genius, was the campaign against Moscow in 1382. This was not just a punitive expedition, but a meticulously planned masterpiece of strategic art aimed at reminding the entire world that the Golden Horde had risen from the ashes. After the Battle of Kulikovo, the Moscow prince Dmitry Donskoy, intoxicated by his victory over Mamai, believed the yoke had been thrown off forever. He stopped paying tribute and considered the new Khan, Tokhtamysh, who came from the east, to be just another temporary figure. This was his fatal mistake. Tokhtamysh decided to teach him a lesson that would be remembered for centuries. He acted with incredible cunning and speed. To conceal his true intentions, he sent envoys to the Russian principalities with friendly speeches, lulling them into a false sense of security. At the same time, he gathered a huge army and moved en russes, not by the traditional southern route, but by making a flanking maneuver to avoid border outposts. His appearance was like a lightning strike from a clear sky. The Prince of Nizhny Novgorod, Dmitry Donskoy's father-in-law, betrayed him in terror, revealing the fords on the Oka River to the horde and sending his own sons as guides. Dmitry Donskoy, caught by surprise and unable to gather his troops, fled Moscow, leaving the city to its fate. The defense was led by the Lithuanian prince Ostej. For 3 days, the Muscovites heroically repelled assaults, even using firearms, tufyaki. Seeing that the city could not be taken by force, Tokhtamysh used his main weapon, deceit. He sent the very same Nizhny Novgorod princes to negotiate, and they swore on the cross that the Khan only wanted to see the great city, would harm no one, and demanded only a symbolic tribute. The Muscovites, exhausted by the siege, believed them and opened the gates. What happened next was a bloodbath. The horde's warriors stormed into the city and carried out a merciless slaughter. According to the chronicles, 24,000 people died. The city was plundered and burned to the ground. The Moscow campaign had a colossal effect. All the Russian princes, including the one from Tver, once again sent envoys with declarations of submission. The payment of tribute was resumed in full. Tokhtamysh had achieved his goal. He not only got the money, he humiliated his strongest vassal and showed that true power had returned. This was his tactical triumph, but it also contained a strategic time bomb. This stunning success finally convinced Tokhtamysh of his own genius and invincibility, giving birth to the very hubris that precedes a fall. At the center of the entire political drama of the late 14th century were the evolving and ultimately fatal relations between two titans, Tokhtamysh and Tamerlane. Initially, their alliance looked like a classic patron-client model. Tamerlane, the Iron Cripple, was the wise and calculating patron, while Tokhtamysh was the grateful and indebted protégé. The letters they wrote to each other during that period were filled with expressions of filial devotion from Tokhtamysh and paternal care from Timur. Timur called Tokhtamysh his son, and Tokhtamysh readily accepted this role, understanding that without Samarkand's support, his power was nothing. But as soon as Tokhtamysh united the entire Golden Horde under his hand and burned Moscow, the balance of power began to shift, at least in his own perception. He ceased to feel like a client and began to see himself as an equal partner, and then a rival. Here, two fundamentally different worldviews collided. For Tamerlane, a Turkic emir with no Chinggis blood in his veins, legitimacy was based on personal strength, on conquests, on divine fortune. He was building his own empire, and the Golden Horde was, in his plans, merely a northern buffer state ruled by a loyal Khan. For Tokhtamysh, however, as a Chinggis to the core, legitimacy was an inherited right. He considered himself the heir not just of the Golden Horde, but of the entire Mongol Empire, including those lands that were now part of Timur's state, Khwarezm, and parts of the Caucasus. He began to see his benefactor not as a father, but as a temporary steward of lands that, by right of blood, belonged to the house of Chinggis Khan. This transformation from gratitude to rivalry was fueled by his entourage, emirs of the old horde nobility, who whispered reminders of past glory and how it was unbecoming for a descendant of Chinggis Khan to be indebted to a lame upstart. The sworn enemies of Tokhtamysh, besides his internal rivals, became anyone who stood in the way of his imperial dream. But his main enemy, as is often the case in great tragedies, ultimately turned out to be his greatest ally. Timur, with his cold and perceptive mind, for a long time did not notice or did not want to notice this change. He continued to see Tokhtamysh as his son until Tokhtamysh made the fateful move that turned the father into an executioner and the ally into a mortal enemy. The key turning point, the very crossroads of fate where history could have taken a completely different path, was Tokhtamysh's decision to invade Tamerlane's domains. This was not a spontaneous act of aggression, but a logical, albeit suicidal, consequence of his entire life philosophy and imperial ambitions. After the triumphant campaign against Moscow in 1382 and the final consolidation of his power in the Horde, Tokhtamysh felt like the master of the world. He believed he had restored the might of the Ulis of Yoki, and the next step had to be the recovery of all territories that had ever been part of it. His gaze turned south, to Khwarezm and Azerbaijan. These rich regions with key trading cities like Urgench and Tabriz had historically been disputed territories between the Johids and the Ilkhanate of Persia. Now, they were firmly under Tamerlane's control. From the perspective of realpolitik, this was madness. Timur's army was better organized, better equipped, and led by a military genius. The economic potential of Timur's empire, with its center in flourishing Transoxiana, far surpassed that of the nomadic Golden Horde. But Tokhtamysh was not thinking in terms of realpolitik, but in terms of sacred right. He was a Chinggis. Timur was not. For him, this was the decisive argument. In 1385, having gathered a huge army, he invaded Azerbaijan, capturing and sacking Tabriz. Simultaneously, his other detachments attacked the borders of Khwarezm. It was a stab in the back, a violation of all the oaths of loyalty he had given his patron. It was a gauntlet thrown down in the face of the iron cripple. At that moment, Tokhtamysh made his choice. He could have remained a powerful but loyal ally of Timur, ruling a vast country, and perhaps passing it on to his heirs. But he chose the path of total confrontation. He gambled everything, his life, his army, his reborn empire, for the ghostly dream of restoring the borders from the time of Batu Khan. He could not and would not be second. His pride, his Chinggis arrogance, did not allow him to acknowledge any authority over himself, not even the authority of the one who had saved and elevated him. This decision, made at the peak of his power, was the beginning of his end. He had awakened the dragon, and now the dragon was coming for him. The zenith of Tokhtamysh's glory came in the mid-1380s. He was the absolute master of a colossal territory, the ruler of a unified and seemingly powerful Golden Horde once more. Sarai Berka, his capital, was again filled with wealth flowing in as tribute from conquered peoples and duties from revived trade routes. His name was spoken with fear in the Russian principalities, with respect in Egypt, and with anxiety in Lithuania. He felt himself to be not just a Khan, but a living embodiment of the celestial will, the one destined to restore the world order established by his great ancestor, Chinggis Khan. It was at this moment that his self-confidence grew into what the ancient Greeks called hubris, a pride that challenges the gods and fate. He ceased to adequately assess reality and began to believe in his own exceptionalism and infallibility. The culmination of this moment of hubris was not only the military invasion of Timur's domains, but also a diplomatic gesture that was even more insulting. According to Timurid historians, Tokhtamysh sent Tamerlane a message whose tone was no longer filial, but defiantly arrogant. In it, he listed all his victories, emphasized his noble lineage, and effectively demanded that Timur cede Khwarezm and Azerbaijan to him, implying that Timur ruled those lands only temporarily, by some misunderstanding. He wrote that if Emir Timur, our faithful servant, did not come to his senses, the fate of Mamai awaited him. This was an unheard-of insult. To call the Iron Cripple, the conqueror of Persia and Khorasan, his servant, was tantamount to a declaration of war. This act demonstrates how much Tokhtamysh had lost touch with reality. He had forgotten that just a few years earlier he had been a penniless exile who owed everything to this very servant. He sincerely believed that his successes were the result of his own talents and divine destiny alone, and that Timur's role had been merely a minor episode. This moment of hubris became the point of no return, after which a peaceful resolution to the conflict became impossible. Tamerlane, known for his cold fury and long memory, could not forgive such humiliation. The insult was public, and the response had to be as well. From that moment on, war between them was inevitable, and it was no longer just a war for territory, but a personal war, a war of two titanic egos, in which not only the future of their empires, but their own honor was at stake. Tamerlane's response was not long in coming, but it was not what Tokhtamysh expected. The Iron Cripple did not rush into battle with his visor up. He was a master of the long, grueling game. His initial reaction was like that of an insulted but wise father. He sent Tokhtamysh a letter, reproaching him for his ingratitude, reminding him of everything he had done for him, and urging him to reconsider. It was a brilliant move, calculated to portray Tokhtamysh to the world as an oath-breaker and an ungrateful son. When Tokhtamysh, in his pride, ignored these admonitions and continued his raids, Timur began to act. In 1387, he delivered his first retaliatory strike, reclaiming Azerbaijan and Khwarezm. But he did not yet undertake a full-scale invasion deep into the Horde steppes. He was waiting, gathering strength and information. The first cracks in Tokhtamysh's power began to appear during this period. His aggressive policy demanded enormous resources. Constant wars drained the treasury and required the mobilization of ever more warriors, which caused discontent among the nomadic nobility, who preferred short, plundering raids to a long and bloody war with a powerful neighbor. Meanwhile, Timur undertook his famous Northern Campaign of 1391. It was a military operation of unprecedented scale. Timur's army of 200,000 moved deep into the uncharted steppes. Tokhtamysh, using traditional Scythian tactics, avoided a decisive battle, luring the enemy deep into his territory, hoping that hunger and hardship would force them to retreat. Timur's army did indeed suffer, but his brilliant organization, iron discipline, and well-thought-out logistics, which even included organizing hunts for wild animals to feed the troops, allowed him to endure the grueling march. These harbingers of the storm showed Tokhtamysh that he was dealing with an opponent of a completely different caliber. His scorched earth tactics, effective against less organized enemies, worked poorly against Timur. He saw that his enemy was not retreating but methodically, like a steamroller, continuing to advance, and that a decisive clash was unavoidable. Anxiety began to stir in the hearts of his emirs. They saw Timur's persistence and power, and began to doubt the wisdom of their Khan, who had dragged them into this deadly war. The illusion of Tokhtamysh's invincibility, born after the capture of Moscow, began to slowly melt away under the scorching sun of the steppe, across which the army of the Iron Cripple moved relentlessly. The fatal act that turned the long war into a catastrophe for the Golden Horde was the Battle of the Kondorcha River on June 18, 1391. It was one of the greatest and bloodiest battles of the Middle Ages, a true ice campaign for Timur, which became a triumph of his military genius and the beginning of the end for Tokhtamysh. After months of exhausting pursuit across the steppes of present-day Kazakhstan and Russia, Timur finally managed to force a decisive battle upon Tokhtamysh. The forces were roughly equal, with both armies, according to various estimates, numbering around 200,000 warriors. Tokhtamysh, confident in the superiority of his light cavalry, and believing the enemy was exhausted by the long march, was eager for a fight. He arranged his troops in a traditional crescent formation, planning to envelop the enemy's flanks and crush them piece by piece. But Timur had anticipated this maneuver. His army was arranged in several lines, with a powerful reserve and a fortified center protected by ditches and shields. He used a tactical innovation, placing infantry between cavalry units, creating a sort of mobile fortress. The battle began with a furious attack by the Horde's cavalry. For a time, it seemed that Tokhtamysh was winning. His warriors managed to break through the left flank of Timur's army. At this critical moment, Tokhtamysh made a fatal mistake. Instead of throwing his reserve into the breach to complete the rout, according to chroniclers, he ordered his warriors in the center to stop and begin looting Timur's captured supply train, believing that victory was already in his grasp. This pause gave Timur precious time. He personally led his elite guard reserve and threw it at the breached flank, cutting it off from the main forces. Simultaneously, his right flank delivered a crushing blow to the weakened left wing of the Horde. The formation of Tokhtamysh's army was broken. Panic set in, which turned into a disorderly retreat. Timur's warriors pursued and cut down the fleeing soldiers for hundreds of kilometers. Tokhtamysh's losses were monstrous. According to some reports, up to 100,000 men. He lost almost his entire army, his harem, and his treasury. He himself barely escaped with a small detachment. The defeat at Kondorcha was not just a military setback, it was a blow from which the Golden Horde could never recover. The myth of Tokhtamysh's invincibility was shattered. His authority in the eyes of his subjects collapsed. And although Timur turned back without advancing on Sarai, the seeds of destruction had been sown. Tokhtamysh had not just lost a battle, he had lost his reputation, and for a ruler in the steppe, that was equivalent to death. The devastating defeat at Kondorcha immediately exposed all the internal abscesses that had previously been hidden by a veil of success and supposed unity in the Golden Horde. The authority of Tokhtamysh, which had recently seemed absolute, collapsed overnight. In the steppe, only strength and luck are respected, and the great Khan had lost both. All his hidden enemies and rivals immediately became active. A quiet internal struggle began, centered on the political intrigues of powerful emirs who now saw Tokhtamysh not as a guarantor of stability, but as the cause of all their troubles. The main figure of this party of the discontented was the emir Idigu, known in Russian chronicles as Edigay. A man of incredible intellect, cunning, and ambition from the noble Manghit clan, Idigu had long been one of Tokhtamysh's closest associates. But after Kondorcha, he realized that the Khan's ship was sinking, and it was time to prepare his own lifeboat, and in the long run, his own fleet. Idigu and other emirs began to weave a complex web of conspiracy. They did not openly oppose the Khan. That would have been too dangerous, as Tokhtamysh, despite his defeat, was still the legitimate ruler and retained a number of loyal followers. Instead, they began to conduct separate negotiations with Tamerlane, sending him secret messengers with assurances of their loyalty and complaints about their unreasonable Khan. They sabotaged Tokhtamysh's orders to raise a new army, spread rumors of his imminent overthrow, and undermined his authority among the common people. Tokhtamysh found himself isolated. He felt the ground slipping from under his feet. He tried to strengthen his power by carrying out exemplary executions of some disloyal emirs, but this only increased the fear and hatred towards him. He was forced to fight a war on two fronts, against an external enemy, Tamerlane, and against an internal, even more dangerous one, in the form of his own entourage. This internal struggle drained the Horde's last remaining strength. Instead of uniting in the face of a mortal threat, the state's elite was busy with intrigues and power struggles. Idigu and his supporters played into Tamerlane's hands, supplying him with information about Tokhtamysh's plans and movements. They were waiting for the opportune moment to strike their sovereign in the back. Thus, the defeat at Kondurcha triggered a chain reaction of disintegration. It not only destroyed the army, but also shattered the fragile unity that Tokhtamysh had so painstakingly created. Now he was not just a defeated general, but a king without a kingdom, surrounded by wolves waiting for his final mistake. Despite the catastrophe at Kondurcha and the growing treason in his own camp, it would be a mistake to consider Tokhtamysh broken. On the contrary, it was during this period that he displayed the very inhuman energy and will that had once brought him to power. He did not accept defeat, but began to feverishly rebuild his strength, preparing for a comeback. This was the first step on the inexorable path to the final reckoning. Using his status as a Chinggis and playing on patriotic sentiments, he managed to raise a new army. It was not as numerous or experienced as the previous one, but it still represented a formidable force. He rushed across his vast domains from Bulgar to Crimea, calling men to arms, executing some and pardoning others. At the same time, he launched a flurry of diplomatic activity, trying to create a broad anti-Timurid coalition. His envoys were sent to Cairo, to the powerful Mamluk Sultan Bark, who also saw a mortal threat in Tamerlane. He negotiated with the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I and with the rulers of Sivas and Asia Minor. He tried to weave a web of alliances that would encircle Timur's empire from all sides. In these activities, his undeniable talent as a statesman was evident. He understood that he could not defeat the Iron Cripple alone and sought allies. However, all these efforts were doomed. His allies were far away. Their interests did not always align with his, and the enemy was near, powerful, and determined. But most importantly, while rebuilding his military might, Tokhtamysh had learned nothing from his defeat. He still believed that his conflict with Timur was merely a matter of military luck, not a fundamental mismatch of power and potential. He did not realize that he had challenged not just a man, but a new historical reality that this man embodied. And so, instead of seeking a path to peace, making concessions, and preserving at least what was left of his state, he, with a stubbornness worthy of a better cause, prepared a new campaign, a new challenge that was destined to be his last. This stage of his life is a tragic demonstration of how great will, unguided by sober calculation, leads directly into the abyss. The second act of the tragedy, which inexorably brought the final chapter closer, began with a new, utterly reckless move by Tokhtamysh. Having barely restored a part of his forces, in 1394, he once again invaded the Caucasus, attacking Shirvan, which was under Timur's protectorate. This act still sparks debate among historians. What was it? A subtle strategic calculation, An attempt to distract Timur, who was at that time waging war in Iran and Iraq? Or was it an act of pure desperation, the death throes of pride, a frantic attempt to show the world that he was not broken and was still capable of challenging his enemy? Most likely, it was both. Tokhtamysh may have hoped that Timur, busy on other fronts, would not be able to respond adequately, and he could score an easy victory that would boost his shattered prestige. He wanted revenge, to prove to himself and his emirs that the defeat at Kondurcha was a fluke. But with this raid, he made his last, fatal mistake. He underestimated the fury and determination of Tamerlane. For the Iron Cripple, this second challenge was the last straw. He saw that Tokhtamysh was incorrigible, that like a wounded snake, he would continue to strike as long as he lived. And Timur made a final decision. His goal was no longer simply to punish an ungrateful son, not just to win another battle. His goal was the complete and final destruction of the Golden Horde as a state, as a geopolitical force that constantly threatened his northern borders. He understood that as long as this steppe empire existed, with its warlike traditions and unpredictable khans, his own state would not be safe. This new raid by Tokhtamysh became the perfect casus belli for Timur. He could now present his invasion not as an act of aggression, but as just retribution, a necessary measure to ensure peace and order. This second challenge was a death sentence for Tokhtamysh. He once again gambled everything, but this time his opponent had entirely different stakes. Timur was not coming to fight, he was coming to destroy. And the full might of his empire, honed in dozens of wars, was unleashed upon the Golden Horde. The Iron Cripple's response to Tokhtamysh's second act of defiance was terrifying in its methodicalness and scale. Upon learning of the invasion of Shirvan, Tamerlane ceased all his operations in the south and turned his war machine north. This was no longer just an army on the march, it was a nation going to war. Timur gathered all the forces of his vast empire. The chronicles speak of a 200,000-strong army, but this likely only counts the combatants. Together with the supply trains, artisans, servants, and families of the warriors, it was a gigantic mass of people, slowly and inexorably crawling north. This time, Timur was even more thoroughly prepared. He had learned from the experience of the Kondurcha campaign. Huge reserves of food and fodder were created. The route was planned meticulously. He chose a western path through the Derbent Pass, the iron gates of the Caucasus, to strike at the very heart of the Golden Horde, at its economically developed centers along the Volga. The psychological preparation for the campaign was no less important than the material one. Timur declared this a holy war, a jihad against unfaithful oathbreakers. His ulama issued fatwas justifying any action against Tokhtamysh and his subjects. The goal was clear and communicated to every soldier, not just to win, but to eradicate, to burn out the very possibility of the Horde's resurgence as a threat. He wanted to teach a lesson that would be remembered for centuries. This armada, moving north in the spring of 1395, was the embodiment of inevitable doom. Tokhtamysh, learning of the scale of the invasion, realized that this time it was about his very survival. He gathered all the forces he could and moved to meet the enemy, hoping to stop them on his southern borders. But his army was a mere shadow of the one that had fought at Kondurcha. It was worse armed, worse trained, and most importantly, its ranks lacked their former confidence. The emirs he had forced into the campaign were secretly corresponding with Idigu and looking for an opportunity to betray him. Tokhtamysh was leading not just an army to its death, he was leading his entire state to the slaughter. And he probably already understood this, but pride and desperation left him no other choice. The culmination of the confrontation between the two titans and the entire history of the reborn Golden Horde, was the Battle of the Terek River, which took place on April 15th, 1395. This battle was not just a defeat for Tokhtamysh, it was a death sentence for his empire. Two enormous armies clashed on a wide plain in the foothills of the Caucasus. Tokhtamysh, having learned from the bitter experience of Kondurcha, acted more cautiously this time. He fortified his positions, and his warriors fought with the desperation of the doomed. On the first day of the battle, the horde even had some success. Their fierce attacks managed to push back the center and left flank of Timur's army. It seemed for a moment that history might reverse its course, and Tokhtamysh would have his long-awaited revenge. But it was at this critical moment that Tamerlane once again demonstrated his tactical genius and composure. He didn't panic and throw his reserves into the fray. Instead, he employed a military ruse that has been written into the textbooks of military art. On his command, a part of his troops, which had been in ambush, suddenly struck the flank and rear of the advancing horde forces, simultaneously raising spare banners. Seeing enemy standards behind them, Tokhtamysh's warriors believed they were surrounded, that they had been betrayed by their own emirs attacking from the rear. Panic erupted in their ranks. At that very moment, Timur threw his main reserve into the battle, his elite guard, which delivered a crushing blow to the faltering center of the enemy. The effect was overwhelming. The orderly battle line of the horde disintegrated in an instant. A chaotic retreat began, which quickly turned into a bloody slaughter. Timur's warriors, enraged by the stubborn resistance, spared no one. The Terek River, according to contemporaries, turned red with blood. Tokhtamysh fled once again, abandoning his army, his people, and his capital to the mercy of the victor. The catastrophe on the Terek was final and irreversible. If after Kondurcha the horde still had resources to recover, now it had lost its last. It was not just an army that was destroyed. The spirit of the nation was broken. From that moment, the Golden Horde, as a unified and powerful state, ceased to exist. Tokhtamysh, who began his journey as a unifier, had led his country to a complete and total devastation from which it would never recover. After the victory on the Terek, Tamerlane began to implement the second, and most important, part of his plan: the economic annihilation of the Golden Horde. He understood perfectly well that a military victory would be temporary if the very foundation of the Steppe Empire's power wasn't undermined. And that foundation was not only its army, but also its rich trading cities located on the Great Silk Road. The horde's wealth came less from tribute from Rus and more from control over the transit trade between East and West. And Timur struck precisely at this Achilles' heel. His army, divided into several corps, swept like a fiery tornado across the entire territory of the Ulus of Yochi. The goal was not conquest, but total destruction. The capital, the magnificent city of Sarai Burqa, one of the largest metropolises of the time, was captured and plundered to the ground. Artisans were taken as slaves to Samarkand, and the city itself was put to the torch. The same fate befell another crucial center, Haji Tarkhan, the future Astrakhan, at the mouth of the Volga. The city of Azak, modern-day Azov, at the mouth of the Don, a key point of trade with the Genoese colonies in Crimea, was razed to the ground. The cities of Magyar in the North Caucasus and Bulgar on the Middle Volga were destroyed. Timur did not just plunder cities. He systematically destroyed irrigation systems, burned fields, and demolished caravanserais. His actions were aimed at redirecting the trade routes to bypass the horde's lands, rerouting them through his own empire, via Iran and Central Asia. And he succeeded. The northern branch of the Great Silk Road, which passed through the Volga region, fell into complete decline. Caravans began to take other roads. The economy of the Golden Horde was decapitated. It lost the source of its wealth and prosperity. This was a far more terrible blow than a battlefield defeat. An army can be raised again, but restoring a ruined economy and bringing trade flows back to old roots was now impossible. Tokhtamysh, by provoking this war with his pride, had unwittingly become the cause of not only the military, but also the economic collapse of his state. Tamerlane, by destroying the cities of the Horde, had effectively killed it, turning it from a prosperous trading power into an impoverished, ravaged steppe, where nomads reverted to primitive pastoralism. It was the end of the golden age of the Ulus of Yoki. Having crushed Tokhtamysh's army and destroyed the Horde's economy, Tamerlane completed his work by creating total political chaos. He did not annex the lands of the Ulus of Yoki to his empire. It was unnecessary and even dangerous for him. His goal was different: to transform his northern neighbor from a powerful state into a conglomerate of small, weak, and warring domains that could never again threaten his borders. He achieved this with a simple and effective method. After leaving the devastated lands of the Volga region, he left behind a complete political vacuum. The power of the central government, embodied by the fugitive Tokhtamysh, was destroyed. But instead of appointing a single strong ruler, Timur placed his bets on several puppet khans from among other Chinggisids hostile to Tokhtamysh. He placed one khan on the throne in Sarai and supported another in the east, in the White Horde. In doing so, he deliberately split the state into two parts and laid the foundation for a new, even more brutal civil war. This move finally shattered the unity of the Ulus of Yoki. Immediately after Timur's departure, a war of all against all began in the steppes. Every emir, every chief of a major tribe, felt like an independent ruler. The main schemer and rival of Tokhtamysh, the emir Idigu, stepped onto the political stage. Relying on his powerful Mongol tribe and the support of a part of the nobility, he effectively created his own state on the ruins of the Horde, the Nogai Horde, becoming its uncrowned ruler. He placed his own puppet khans on the throne in Sarai, entering into conflict with those left by Timur. The Golden Horde had finally and irreversibly disintegrated. In its territory, the Khanates of Kazan, Astrakhan, Crimea, and Sibir, as well as the Great Horde, would soon emerge. The process that Tokhtamysh had halted with his iron will in 1380 had now resumed with tenfold force, and there was no one left to stop it. Thus, the paradox came full circle. Tokhtamysh, the unifier of the Horde, through his own actions, created the conditions for its complete and final collapse. Like an inexperienced chemist, he mixed two dangerous reagents: his boundless ambition and the monstrous power of Tamerlane. The result was an explosion that blew his own laboratory, his state, to pieces. For Tokhtamysh himself, the most humiliating and tragic period of his life began. The Great Khan, ruler of the unified Golden Horde, the victor who burned Moscow, had once again, as in his youth, become an exile and a fugitive. But while in his youth he was full of hope and energy, now he was a ghost of the past, a living symbol of a crushing defeat. His wanderings after the Battle of the Terek are a sad epilogue to a great drama. With a handful of loyal followers, he fled north to the lands of Bulgar, trying to find support there. But no one wanted to tie their fate to a loser. Then he rushed east, but there too, all roads were closed to him. His former subjects, the emirs who just yesterday had sworn loyalty to him, now slammed the city gates in his face and hurried to pledge allegiance to the new khans appointed by Timur or Idigu. His name had become a curse. He had transformed from a symbol of revival into the personification of catastrophe, the man who had brought the wrath of the iron cripple upon the steppe. For a time, he found refuge in Lithuania, with the Grand Duke Vytautas, who, like Timur once had, decided to use the noble exile in his own political games against the growing influence of Idigu. Vytautas even tried to restore Tokhtamysh to the throne, but their combined army suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of the Vorskla River in 1399 against the forces of Idigu's protege, Khan Timur Kutlugh. This was the last major battle in which Tokhtamysh participated. After it, he completely lost all hope of regaining power. He became merely the leader of a small band of robbers, wandering the outskirts of his former empire. He who once ruled millions could now barely feed a few dozen of his last companions. The circle of his life was complete. He began his journey as a persecuted exile, fleeing from Urus Khan, and he ended it in exactly the same way. Only now his main hunter was his former associate, Idigu. It was the ultimate irony of fate, the man who fought so desperately for power to never be a victim again, found himself in the very same humiliating position at the end of his life, having lost absolutely everything. The primary gravedigger of Tokhtamysh and his legacy became the one who was once a pillar of his power, the Emir Idigu. Their confrontation in the final years of Tokhtamysh's life became a personal vendetta, symbolizing the definitive change of eras in the steppe. Idigu was the embodiment of a new type of leader. Like Mamai, he was not a Genghis, but this did not bother him. He understood that the sacred right of blood no longer held decisive importance. What mattered was real military strength, based on the loyalty of one's own tribe and political cunning. After Tamerlane's departure, it was Idigu who became the de facto master of the western part of the former horde. He did not aspire to the title of Khan, preferring to remain in the shadows, but it was he who decided who would sit on the throne in Sarai. He created a new powerful state on the basis of his native Manghit Ulus, the Nogai Horde, which became one of the main successors of the Golden Horde. And to establish his authority, he needed to eliminate the last threat, the last symbol of the old order, Tokhtamysh. As long as Tokhtamysh was alive, even as an exile, he remained a legitimate Genghisid, a banner around which all the discontented could theoretically rally. Therefore, Idigu launched a veritable hunt for him. He pursued him across the entire Deshti Kipchak, from the Dnieper to the Irtysh. This was no longer a war for the throne, but a personal settling of scores. Idigu wanted not just to defeat Tokhtamysh, he wanted to destroy him, to erase the very memory of him. He saw in him the past that was preventing him from building the future. Tokhtamysh, in turn, hated Idigu fiercely, seeing him as the chief traitor who had taken advantage of his misfortune. Their struggle was a struggle between two principles: the departing legitimate monarchy based on the right of blood, and the arriving pragmatic power based on strength and intrigue. Idigu, like Tamerlane, was a man of the new era, while Tokhtamysh, with his dream of restoring Batu's empire, was hopelessly behind the times. The outcome of this struggle was predetermined. Idigu was younger, more energetic, backed by real power and the support of most of the emirs who were tired of Tokhtamysh's endless wars. He was the future, and Tokhtamysh was already the past. The last battle of Tokhtamysh's life was not a grand clash of armies, but a pathetic skirmish, the last desperate dash of a hunted animal. After the defeat on the Vorskla, he completely lost all his influential allies. Grand Duke Vytautas realized the futility of trying to restore him to the throne and left him to his fate. With a small detachment of his most loyal followers, Tokhtamysh fled far to the east, to Siberia, hoping to lose himself in the vast forests and steppes where Idigu's power was not so strong. But even there, the relentless hand of his enemy found him. Idigu, obsessed with the idea of finishing off his old master, sent a detachment led by his own sons in pursuit. For years they followed his trail, and finally, in 1406, somewhere near modern-day Tiumen, they caught up with him. What happened next was not a battle, but a massacre. The pathetic remnants of Tokhtamysh's forces were surrounded and completely annihilated. He fought to the last, as befits a descendant of Genghis Khan, but the forces were too unequal. The circle was closed, completely and irrevocably. He began his journey as a fugitive, pursued by a stronger enemy, and he ended it in exactly the same way. His entire incredible life, full of dizzying highs and devastating lows, fit into this tragic cycle. Exile, ascent, triumph, hubris, fall, exile, death. His defeat at the hands of Itagu's men was deeply symbolic. It was not just the victory of one enemy over another. It was the victory of a new, pragmatic, and ruthless political reality over the old one, based on tradition and sacred right. Itagu, the non-Genghisid, destroyed the last great Genghisid who tried to rule in the old way. And with Tokhtamysh's last breath, the last hope for the restoration of a unified Golden Horde also died. He took it with him to his unmarked grave in the Siberian taiga. The ironic finale of Tokhtamysh's story, and the ultimate answer to the main question posed at the very beginning, lies in the deepest and most tragic paradox. He became the destroyer of the Golden Horde, not in spite of his greatness, but precisely because of it. His ruin came not from weakness, but from his greatest strength, his boundless, unshakable ambition to restore the empire to its ideal, mythical borders of its founder's time. Had he been less ambitious, a more pragmatic ruler, he might have been content with what he had. He could have ruled a unified, though somewhat smaller, horde, remaining a loyal, albeit junior, ally of Tamerlane. He could have strengthened his dynasty, improved the economy, and gone down in history as the wise ruler who revived his country after the Great Troubles. But he was not that man. His greatness would not allow him to be second. His Genghisid blood boiled at the thought that he, a descendant of the conqueror of the universe, should submit to some lame emir from Samarkand. It was his dream of a great horde, stretching from the Danube to the Irtysh, including Khwarezm and the Caucasus, that forced him to challenge Tamerlane. He could not accept the new geopolitical reality in which his horde was no longer the hegemon, but just one of several great powers. He tried to turn back the clock, to bring back a bygone golden age, and in that attempt, he broke both himself and his country. His actions were like those of a man trying to stop a speeding train by standing in its path. The result was predictable. Thus, the answer to the question how is simple. Through pride, born of a great dream. He destroyed the horde because he loved it too much, but his love was blind and selfish. He loved not the real horde of the late 14th century, but an idealized ghost from the past. And in chasing that ghost, he brought his country to its real demise. The death of Tokhtamysh in 1406 was the final period on his epic and tragic biography, definitively closing the composition of his fate. He who once ruled half the known world died not in his capital, surrounded by family and dignitaries, but as an unknown fugitive in the dense Siberian taiga. According to one version, he was killed in battle with Itagu's men. According to another, more prosaic one, he was treacherously stabbed in his sleep by a Siberian Khan who wanted to curry favor with the all-powerful ruler of the Nogai horde. Regardless of the details, his end was inglorious and lonely. His body was likely buried, without any honors, in an unmarked grave that has never been found. And in this obscure death lay its own deep, ironic symbolism. The man who fought his entire life for names, titles, and and the restoration of his family's greatness, was ultimately left without a final resting place, without a mausoleum worthy of a descendant of Genghis Khan. His journey ended just as it had begun, in obscurity and exile. With his death, an entire era passed away. He was the last Khan who managed, even for a short time, to unite the entire Ulus of Yochi under his rule. After him, no one would ever be able to do so again. The Golden Horde finally disintegrated into warring Khanates, which would be absorbed one by their stronger neighbors, primarily the rising state of Muscovy. The death of Tokhtamysh was the final nail hammered into the coffin of the great steppe empire. He lived a life as bright as a flash of lightning. He soared higher than any of his contemporaries in the steppe and fell deeper than anyone else. His story is about how one man, driven by a great dream, was able to revive an empire from the ashes, and then, blinded by his own success, destroy it with his own hands. His death did not cause grief in the world. Rather, it was met with a sigh of relief from his many enemies. But for history, it marked the end of one great chapter and the beginning of several new ones, in which a very different and far less enviable role was destined for the descendants of Genghis Khan. The legacy of Tokhtamysh, viewed through the prism of centuries, proved to be as contradictory and paradoxical as his entire life. In the historical memory of different peoples, he left a completely different, sometimes diametrically opposed, mark. For Russian history, he remains forever one of the cruelest and most cunning conquerors. His name is strongly associated with the burning of Moscow in 1382, with betrayal and a merciless massacre that long delayed the liberation of Rus from the Horde's yoke. In Russian chronicles and popular memory, he is a symbol of perfidy and the evil Tatar, who came with fire and sword when he was least expected. His triumph became a national tragedy for Rus, and his subsequent fall was seen as just divine retribution. His image appears completely different in the historical memory of the Tatar and other Turkic peoples, the heirs of the Golden Horde. For them, Tokhtamysh is, above all, the last great Khan, the last ruler who managed to unite the nation and restore its former might. He is a tragic hero who challenged Tamerlane himself, defending the sovereignty and honor of his state. In this interpretation, his campaign against Moscow was not an act of senseless cruelty, but the just punishment of rebellious vassals, a restoration of lawful order. His defeat is a national catastrophe, resulting not only from his personal pride, but also from the betrayal of emirs like Idigu. For them, he is a symbol of lost unity and past greatness, the last glimmer of the setting sun of the great steppe empire. His story is a parable of how internal strife and a clash with a superior external force led to the demise of a once mighty state. Thus, Tokhtamysh is forever frozen in history as a figure with two faces. For some, a ruthless tyrant; for others, a tragic national hero. And this duality best reflects the complexity of his personality and the era in which he was fated to live and rule. And so, we return to the central paradox laid out at the very beginning of our narrative, to provide a final, comprehensive answer. Tokhtamysh became the destroyer of the Golden Horde, precisely because he was its last great Khan. His greatness and his destructive power stemmed from the same source, his obsession with the idea of restoration. He was not a reformer, but a restorer. He did not want to build a new horde, adapted to the realities of the late 14th century. He wanted to recreate the old, mighty empire of Batu and Berk's time. This was a grand, but utterly utopian, goal. The world had changed. To the south, the colossal empire of Tamerlane had risen. To the west, Lithuania and the Grand Duchy of Moscow had grown stronger. Trade routes had begun to shift. In these new conditions, the Horde could survive only as a strong but regional state, open to compromise and alliances. But Tokhtamysh's greatness, his imperial consciousness nurtured on the legends of his ancestors, did not allow him to accept this new reality. He could not accept the role of Tamerlane's junior partner because in his worldview, a descendant of Genghis Khan could not be junior to anyone. His greatness lay in the fact that for a short time, he managed to make everyone believe in the possibility of this restoration. He united the country. He forced Russes to pay tribute. He returned the Horde to the status of a great power. But this was merely a facade, behind which lay economic and political weakness. And when, blinded by success, he tried to turn this facade into a real imperial structure by challenging Tamerlane, the entire construction collapsed, burying both him and his people beneath it. He was too great for his time. His ambitions belonged to the 13th century, but he had to act at the end of the 14th. And this mismatch between the scale of his personality and the scale of the era was the cause of the tragedy. He was the last bearer of the old imperial spirit, and this spirit, when it collided with the new historical reality, burned up, leaving only ashes behind. Ultimately, the story of Tokhtamysh transcends the biography of a single-step Khan, becoming a timeless and universal parable about the nature of power, ambition, and the inexorable march of time. It is a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions about how a person's greatest virtues can turn into their fatal flaws. The will that allowed him to rise from rags to riches turned into a stubbornness that prevented him from stopping in time. The dream of a great empire that inspired him to heroic deeds grew into a pride that blinded him and led him to make a suicidal mistake. His story is a stark warning to all leaders, all empire builders, a reminder that the past cannot be reclaimed, and the attempt to do so often leads to the destruction of the future. Tokhtamysh teaches us that a ruler's true greatness lies not in blindly copying the deeds of ancestors, but in soberly assessing reality and finding a path for one's people in a changed world. He lost not because Tamerlane was stronger, but because Tamerlane was a man of the future, while Tokhtamysh was a man of the past. The Iron Cripple built his empire on new principles, on the strength of a regular army, on the development of cities and trade, on a synthesis of Turkic, Persian, and Mongol cultures. Tokhtamysh, on the other hand, tried to resuscitate the old nomadic empire that had already outlived itself. And in this clash of two worlds, two epochs, his defeat was inevitable. And when we look at the ruins of Sarai Berk, or read the mournful lines of the chronicles about the burning of Moscow, we must remember that behind these tragedies lies not just the will of an evil tyrant, but the complex and multifaceted story of a man who loved greatness too much and paid for that love with the complete destruction of everything he had created. His fate is an eternal lesson that even the noblest ambitions, if they lack a sense of proportion, lead not to glory, but to catastrophe.